Now recognizes Mr. Walden, the Republican leader of the full committee, for 5 minutes for his opening statement. Representative.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman, and thank you. As we examine the bill today from Mrs. Bonamici and others, I must say I'm actually of several minds, and let me explain. At a 50,000-foot level, I join my colleagues in wanting to see an end to mesothelioma, cancer, and other pulmonary diseases precipitated by asbestos. I think we all want that. To the family suffering and those with these diseases right now and those who have lost loved ones to them, I'm deeply sympathetic to you and obviously for the advocates of this bill. I recognize the tragedies you have faced, and I understand you want a solution once and for all. I also appreciate the way my colleague, Mr. Shimkus, has said about the process he authored a few years ago to modernize the law to address questions of safety about chemicals. I think these have to be fact-based decisions. And as we speak, and that Mrs. Dunn will talk about on the first panel today, if Congress is going to consistently, though, preempt the sort of science-based EPA reviews with statutory mandates, one has to ask the question, then, what's the point of all these newly expanded authorities under TSCA? Even well-meaning legislation can, frankly, be a bit of a blunt instrument for problem-solving where, if not careful, Congress can create risk trade-offs that spawn unintended public health risks, institute unimplementable enforcement requirements, or require complex and hard-to-meet compliance obligations. So as I went through and looked at this legislation, a number of questions came to mind. This legislation requires any mixture or article that is distributed in commerce to not have asbestos present as an impurity. So my question is, does this apply to incidental fibers? Do American businesses have to test and certify every product sold in this country to guarantee it does not contain any asbestos, regardless of whether it was intentionally added? Do people in rural areas no longer get to use gravel for roads? Should talcum powder fall under this, or would it be exempted as an FDA-regulated product? These are just some of the questions that come to mind. The legislation also requires very specific and complex reporting to the EPA by those who either manufactured, imported, processed, or moved in commerce asbestos or mixtures or articles containing asbestos, including an incidental amount, in the 3 years prior to and 1 year after the bill's enactment. So prior to and 1 year after. So how does a person report an incidental amount when they weren't expected to track it? What's the utility of all this reporting to EPA on top of information from EPA's chemical data reporting, especially if the substance is already banned? Why is personally identifying information disclosed to the public? We're doing a lot on privacy in this committee. So the question, why is personally identifying information disclosed to the public from each report when EPA is only required to produce an aggregated report that isn't specific to each person reporting? Finally, the legislation provides a shorter transition period and moots existing TSCA provisions preempting an exemption for use of a chemical that provides greater public health protection than its alternatives, which I think is a pretty important point. I'm especially concerned about the immediate loss of 36%, that's over 1/3 of our nation's chlorine production, and what that means for hospital disinfection, drinking water treatment, pharmaceutical production, and the like. The resources required could push businesses to import materials rather than make them here. And do healthcare costs and drinking water rates spike? Does availability of these services lessen, or do gaseous chlorine shipments come to our major ports? So to protect the economic health of working men and women, are alternatives technologically and economically feasible? I think that's a question we need to look at. And if so, are they drop-in ready and safer? So, Mr. Chairman, while I support the intent, certainly, of my colleague from Oregon, Ms. Bonamici, and others, I do think there are these questions among a whole list that if we're going to legislate in this space, we need to get answers to if we're going to be responsible. So I look forward to hearing from each of our witnesses today. I know their testimony will better clarify some of these for me, and I appreciate that. I would also say at the outset we have 2 subcommittees meeting simultaneously, and since I'm on both, I'll be coming and going. But I do have your written testimony, and again, we all want to make the world safer, and for those who are suffering or who have lost someone, you are in our hearts, and we want to do the right thing here. So with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.